Okay, welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar on how the European elections will impact EU and UK relations. My name is Laura and I'm an Associate Director for European Affairs at Whitehouse Communications. And I am joined by two great panelists, David Martin, current President of the European Movement in Scotland, which is a pressure group advocating for closer alignment with European values and an eventual return to the EU. David has extensive experience serving in the European Parliament, having been a Labour MEP for 35 years between 1984 and 2019. And he was also the Vice-President of the European Parliament for 15 years. And Jannike Wachowiak, a researcher at the think tank UK in Changing Europe, with a focus on her work, particularly on Brexit and the implication for the EU, and also previously a researcher at a think tank called European Policy Centre in Brussels. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have flowing discussions in the next, I would say, 45 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor to the audience. And please do put your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, I've been told. So let's get started by setting the scene. 2024 is a huge year of change. We have elections in about 60 countries, including the US, India, and of course the UK and the EU. With less than a month to go between the 6th and the 9th of June, millions of Europeans will go to the polls to elect the new members of the European Parliament. And this year's elections will be watched very closely for a number of reasons. First of all, they are the first elections held since Brexit. We expect that new members of the European Parliament will make about 54% of the next Parliament. And opinion polls forecast significant gains for the far right and the anti-establishment, which could potentially have far-reaching consequences for the EU policy agenda and also for the relations with the UK. On the other side of the channel, the next UK elections are also looming, with most analysts expecting it to be called late in this year, in the autumn, most likely. And after 13 years of Conservative rule, Keir Starmer's party has consistently been ahead of the polls and is expected to win at the elections. So since signing the historic Windsor Framework agreement last February, relations between the two blocs have steadily improved following years of fracture in the aftermath of Brexit. But with elections looming, a political change ahead, what lies ahead? So let's dive right into it with David, starting with you. Given the backdrop of the growing global uncertainty, we have the war in Ukraine, increased inflation in recent years, and the US placed a huge emphasis on the need to boost its competitiveness. What do you think are the primary issues that facing the EU and member states over the course of the next 5 years? And do you expect this to differ from policy priorities in the UK?
Whoa, good question to kick us off. Firstly, before I get to competitiveness or the UK, just almost in a telegraphic way, it's probably worth mentioning just to give people the scale of the challenge that the EU is going to face. Firstly, and I won't dive into this in too much detail, but the biggest challenge might not come from the UK election or the European Parliament elections, but from the US election. If we have the reincarnation of Donald Trump and what that might mean for Europe. But yeah, the issues Europe faces are enormous at the moment. Firstly, you mentioned Ukraine, which clearly is a challenge in itself. The first time we've had a war, not inside Europe, but a war from an outside country trying to invade part of Europe. We've had civil wars, sadly, in Europe, but we haven't had such a threat, existential threat to Europe before. And Europe has to work out whether it can keep any unity in that respect. We have, for example, fifth columnists in the shape of Slovakia and Hungary inside the decision-making process. Similarly with China, how do we deal with the trade and economic issues coming from China when, again, maybe the same fifth columnist, but we have someone like Orban clearly assisting the Chinese rather than actually assisting the European cause. The EU has recently just completed a migration pact. The next 5 years will tell whether it can actually make that work. It was almost impossible to get an agreement, but they got an agreement. It's going to be equally challenged now, having got an agreement, to make it stick. We've got the green transition issue. We've got the rule of law issue. And then we come to competitiveness, which is becoming a big issue inside the European Union. And I suppose the easiest way to deal with that issue is to quote the 4 headlines that von der Leyen herself gave, which is that Europe has to improve its access to capital for its companies. And that means improving the capital market inside the European Union, something that's been around almost as long as I have, but has yet to be agreed. We have to find ways of, Europe has to find ways of reducing energy costs at the same time as remaining green. It has to improve the skills of its workforce, and it has to strengthen its trade with the rest of the world. So, I mean, that's an enormous agenda. And coming to the last part of your question, in some strange ways, this actually helps the UK, because many of these issues are actually the same things that the EU, that the UK could offer or could work with the EU on. Clearly, the UK and the EU working together on Ukraine would be beneficial, and it's happening, but it could be deeper, it could be more effective than it currently is. Fortunately, we've moved away from David Cameron's position while he was Prime Minister on China, and I think the EU and the UK's analysis of China now is very similar. So again, there's room for cooperation there in dealing with the Chinese issues, and both entities face migration problems. So there are a lot of useful things there to work on. In terms of competitiveness, even there's probably some issues. Again, it links back to China, but not just China. Both entities are concerned about their supply chains, and again, there may be useful cooperation there in ensuring supply chains and mutually accepting each other's the security that comes from each other's supply, from each other's manufacturing products. But competitiveness, probably to conclude, is probably where the biggest possibility of divergence comes, with the EU looking to beef up its industrial strategy to protect its own industries more. There could be difficulties there, and linked to that, it's already happening, but might intensify. The increase in state aids that the European Union member states and the European Union Commission is now permitting is also a threat to the UK industry, and obviously there's a threat there of the UK retaliating. So I think, in summary, there's room for cooperation. There's also room for major divergence between the two, but both entities face enormous challenges, and they'd be better off working together to try and solve them than working separately.
Yeah, Jannike, so David mentioned quite a few interesting points, including indeed migration pact, competitiveness, energy cost, Green Deal. What do you think is there anything else, or do you agree, are you aligned with these being primary issues facing both blocs in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I'm aligned with David. So I do. I think, yeah, David, you've given a really good comprehensive overview of all the kind of challenges facing the EU in the next 5 years. I think what's certainly true is that the geopolitical context will loom large over this election and the next 5 years. And that means that competitiveness, but also security and defense are two of the kind of the key issues that the EU has to deal with. And I think it's quite interesting to think back to 2019, so the last European Parliament election, because actually the kind of narrative is quite different this time round. I mean, last time fighting climate change was a big topic, and we had kind of Fridays for Future in the media everywhere. Greta Thunberg had just started her school strikes the year before the election. Green parties achieved their best ever result in the last European Parliament election. It certainly doesn't feel this way this time round, and Green parties are expected to lose seats. So I think there's going to be a big impact on kind of the green ambitions, but also the way that the EU is going to implement things it has already decided. So that's the one thing. And I think with the kind of big geopolitical challenges, so obviously Ukraine has raised questions around Europe's ability to defend itself. And this gets even more pressing if, as David rightly says, Donald Trump is re-elected in the US later this year. And around competitiveness, I think you have kind of similar topics, because the question is how can the EU remain competitive if a lot of the pillars that it used to rely on, like cheap energy from Russia, exports from China, the US commitment to European security, maybe aren't as solid as they used to be anymore. And I agree with David that the EU and the UK share a lot of interests and also a lot of similar threat perceptions in those areas. So there is certainly scope for cooperation, but at the same time, there's also a kind of pessimistic voice in my head that says, well, there are also key challenges, because on the one hand, the red lines on both sides remain mostly unchanged. Even if Labour wins the election, they have been very clear: no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. And the EU, on the other hand, will prioritize the integrity of the single market, and also the principle that EU membership must matter, and that they won't create privileged access for a third country in the different policy areas. And I think there's a big question mark for me over the EU strategic autonomy agenda in particular, and how open or closed this is going to be, because the EU is clearly moving towards more self-reliance in lots of areas, and wants to promote its own domestic industries, be that the defense industry or the batteries industry. And the question is the UK in or out of this vision of strategic autonomy? And at the moment, to me, in many areas, it looks as if the UK is not featuring in the EU's thinking on those areas, and that could make it very difficult to cooperate even under a Labour government.
Interesting. Thank you. I mean, there's so much to unpack in here. The first thing that I wanted to pick up on is you mentioned Greens will have less seats in the next European elections. And we did say earlier, we expect the shift towards the political right, but at the same time, a shift towards the centre-left in the UK. So how likely it is that in this framework, there are chances of, or any obstacles to further cooperation, essentially?
Do you want me to go first, or David?
Yeah, Jannike, please. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing that I would say is that the European Parliament is probably not the main interlocutor when it comes to UK-EU relations. And when we think about the future of the relationship, the member states and also the Commission are probably going to play a more important role. But nevertheless, if you look at the European Parliament, and if you look at the manifestos of the different political groups that been published ahead of the elections, most of those political groups are actually in favor of closer ties with the UK, and that also applies to the ECR group, the group that is to the right of the EPP, the centre right. The far right group, the ID, they haven't published a manifesto, which also says a lot about kind of cohesion within the group. But basically, almost all of the manifestos do mention the UK at some point, mainly in the context of security and defence. So I think it's unlikely that the new European Parliament will be an obstacle to closer relations. But at the same time, I don't think it will be the most important interlocutor for a Labour government. But at the same time, it's important to think about knock-on effects from the European Parliament elections. So the new European Parliament will have a say on who becomes the next president of the European Commission. And last time von der Leyen won the vote by only 8 votes, so it was extremely narrow, and an increasingly fragmented European Parliament is going to make that even more challenging for her this time round, and it's going to be a balancing act for her in terms of her priorities and how she presents herself, and basically where she gets her votes from. Because even though the kind of centre, the grand coalition of EPP, S&D and Liberals is expected to hold, she can't be certain that all of those will actually also vote for her. So I think, yeah, there's a knock-on effect from the European Parliament election on the composition of the European Commission, which is going to be important. Not just who's the Commission president, but also who's the commissioner who gets the relationship with the UK as part of their portfolio. Obviously, last time round we had Maroš Šefčovič, and he was certainly also a vice president and a kind of a big hitter in the Commission. And the relationship with the UK was kind of a crucial part of his portfolio. I think we might see a bit of a deprioritization of the relationship with the UK in the next political cycle. And the other knock-on effect of the European Parliament election is probably that, well, obviously the European Parliament is a co-legislator, and any legislation that comes out of the EU also impacts the UK and impacts UK businesses that want to trade to the single market. We've seen lots of legislative activity ahead of the European Parliament elections, but we know that things might slow down or become more difficult in a more fragmented European Parliament. So that might actually make things a bit easier for the UK in terms of just keeping pace and keeping up with what's coming out of the EU. But I see those kind of two things as the main knock-on effects. So on the one hand, who are in the EU top jobs? How does the new Commission look like? And then also how is the new Parliament able to legislate, and what does that mean for the UK?
David, what are your thoughts?
In some ways, I mean, I agree with much of that, but in some ways I also think that the new Parliament is going to be plus ça change, plus ça la même chose, because the fact that we are going to have these wings, I think, is going to push the centre together even more firmly. Not necessarily a good thing in terms of reflecting the way people have voted or any desire for change in the way Europe is run, but I think the reality is the S&D, the EPP, the Renew or Liberals, whatever they're called, the next Parliament will be forced together, because it will be the only way we get some coherence in the process. And I agree, I think when the new Commission is appointed, we're going to have probably a series of minor crises. There will be one or two commissioners who are picked on, as it were, who are found to be unacceptable, will be voted down by the Parliament because you can't put together a coalition behind them. But nevertheless, I still think, maybe with a slight delay this time, maybe it might take instead of November or January before we get the new Commission. But I think we will have a von der Leyen Commission, maybe not with the original nominees that are made in November, but I think that will eventually play out, but it will be more difficult than in the past because of this difficulty to put majorities together. I absolutely agree, though, on legislation. Legislation is going to be much tougher because unless the EPP, for example, are prepared to make concessions to the S&D on, say, environment and social policy, and the S&D are prepared to make sacrifices to the EPP on, I don't know, internal market and trade policy, it's going to be quite difficult to find clear majorities for some of those legislative issues. So that could be a difficult spell. But actually, overall, the history of the right in the Parliament to date has been, and Jannike already suggested this in terms of their inability to produce a manifesto, is they fragment and they have virtually no influence because they are so divided among themselves. But they're still there and they still count the numbers. And just going back to the election of the Commission President, there will be initial problems because that has to be done by an absolute majority, not a qualified majority, which is why it makes it quite tricky. But I nevertheless believe we will get there. In terms of relations with the UK, I would be a bit more positive about Parliament's possible role there. I think Parliament could help set the agenda, set the tone. Obviously, it's correct to say it's the Commission and Member States who will absolutely make the decisions in the end. It could help the tone. And one of the things I'd like the new Parliament to do, and I'm surprised and disappointed that the outgoing Parliament hasn't done more of this, is to make better use of the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly that was set up under the TCA, because it really, well, maybe I haven't followed it closely, but as far as I can see, it has had no impact whatsoever. And that could be a good debating forum, a good agenda-setting forum if used properly. And lastly, on the European elections, nothing to do with the Parliament itself, but the one worry I would have about the European elections is because, and sadly, despite having been a member of it for so long, I have to acknowledge European elections are second-order elections, because we're going to have so many protest-type votes and protest parties elected. This might scare the horses a little bit inside some of the member states and make them more reluctant in terms of European agreements and so on. And it might make things more difficult at the council level as well.
Wow, very interesting. You mentioned the TCA, so I wanted to bring that into the context. So, Jannike, we expect the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, coming in 2025, or actually most likely in 2026. Labour has expressed an eagerness to deepen ties with the EU, whereas the EU views this as a little bit less of an administrative checkup. Do you see the upcoming review as an opportunity to work towards closer partnership?
Before I say something about the TCA review, I just wanted to respond to something that David said. Just to say that I agree that the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly can play an important role, and I think it's actually quite crucial in terms of deepening political contacts, because I think that's the one thing that we've seen over the first 3 years of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that there's a lot of work going on at the technical level, and we have all these specialized committees under the TCA, and lots of kind of technical cooperation, but that isn't necessarily true for the political level. So I think it's important for the two sides to kind of deepen political contacts, also because the TCA currently doesn't foresee a political summit or anything like that between the two sides. So I agree that the Partnership Assembly has an important role to play, and I think they've actually tried to kind of push for closer relations. They've released 2 recommendations, one on cooperation on Ukraine and one on youth mobility, which kind of are probably could possibly drive the debate. So I think I agree with David on that. That kind of political contacts are going to be crucial to move the debate forward. In terms of the TCA and the review, I think my view is that this is quite likely going to be a fairly technical exercise. So the review clause in the TCA is not unusual, so this can be found in other free trade agreements as well. It's not specific to the UK-EU relationship, and the clause is very short. It's very vague, but it's clear in a way that it says this is a review of the implementation of the agreement. It's not a review of the agreement itself. And I think there is little incentive for the EU to go further than that, because they see the TCA as a good agreement. It works for them. It mainly deals with trade and goods, where the EU has a surplus with the UK. And also, I think it's important to remember that the TCA doesn't only balance UK and EU interests, but on the EU side, it also balances the interests of 27 member states. And reopening the TCA risks upsetting this balance. So I think the EU is going to be very careful around that, because the TCA just balances so many different member state and institutional interests. Also, and that kind of goes back to what we discussed at the very beginning of the webinar, the EU has lots of other pressing priorities, and the relationship with the UK is definitely not up there. I think there is an interest in cooperating more closely with the UK, particularly on foreign and security policy and on youth mobility. But when it comes to the trading part of the TCA, I think this works quite well from an EU perspective. And as long as the UK doesn't shift its red lines, I think we can see some tinkering around the edges and maybe the addition of a veterinary agreement, things like that, but we're not going to see any substantial changes. And even in terms of the smaller changes that are possible, I don't think there's necessarily a need to wait for the TCA review. There are other ways of kind of making amendments or additions to the TCA. The Partnership Council has quite wide-ranging powers in that regard. There are also some things in the TCA where I think waiting for the review, which would be in 2026, might be leaving it a little bit too late. So one example is the linking of the emission trading systems, which is encouraged by the TCA. I think if that's something that Labour government would want to do, it would probably be better to do it sooner rather than later, because it only gets more complicated the longer you wait. Because on the one hand, you might see more divergence between the approaches and the pricing systems on both sides, which will make it more difficult to link the systems. And also, very importantly, the EU CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, takes full effect from the 1st of January 2026. And that could mean that there are going to be costs, additional costs and additional bureaucratic burdens on UK-EU trade, particularly for kind of carbon-intensive goods like steel, iron, or electricity. And if you don't have that conversation before the CBAM takes full effect, well, then you will be in quite a difficult. Then you will kind of feel the full impact of that. So I think there are many reasons not to wait for the review, and it's more likely that it's going to be a technical exercise.
David.
Yeah, I'm sorry if we sound like we're singing from the same hymn sheet, but I agree with that as well. But also from a different angle. As we've discussed, we're going to have new institutions. Some faces will come back, but we're going to have half a parliament is going to be new, possibly half a commission is going to be new.
Yeah.
Council of Ministers are rolling, changing seats all the time. And we have, hopefully, we're going to have a new government in the UK in the autumn. And I think it's very important that things happen quickly after that there is some momentum behind improving the relationship. And if we wait for the review of the TCA, even if it happens in 2026, even if it was to be more wide-ranging than Jannike suggests it will be, and I think she's right, it won't be very wide-ranging, it would then take time for anything to be implemented after the 2026. So I think it's important we find small things, or what may appear small things, quickly, so we can improve our relationship quickly and set out a good new dynamic between the UK and the EU. And I think the environment is a key part of that, and for the reasons that again have been set out in terms of the emission trading scheme. And as far as I know, Labour's in favour of that. The EU is going ahead with it anyway. We don't want another trade barrier between us, which there would be if we don't agree on a common commission trading scheme. So we need to work hard on that. So I think that's one thing that could be done. I think, to be honest, a lot of the other things are going to have to be unilateral UK things to keep us in line with the European Union. So the famous dynamic alignment, keeping our standards as close to the EU as possible. And that itself is going to be difficult because, as we know, there's a tension between wanting closer alignment and becoming a rule taker. We don't want to be a rule taker at the EU level. So there will be that tension, but I think our industry would actually welcome us if it came closer, more an aligner than a worrying about being the rule taker. And again, there's a couple of other things. I mean, maybe just a pet thing of mine, but I've heard, because being in Scotland, where we have a number of small food producers and so on, they are very, very concerned about what's been called the border taxes charged for sanitary and phytosanitary products coming into the UK from abroad. It's only, the government says, only £145 an assignment. But if you're a small producer sending retailer importing small packages, small assignments, that cost builds up. It costs you your company money, and it's costing the consumer money, because it doesn't matter how big the industry is. All the industries are paying this, and it's pushing food prices up as well. Labour could actually decide just to abolish that, and it would be a good sign for our consumers and importers, but also a good sign for the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Jannike, any thoughts on what David was saying in terms of this rule taker, and how do you see that playing out from the Labour side of things?
I think it's quite interesting that if you look at the evolution in the UK's approach on divergence, that in a way we kind of have a consensus between the two major parties not to pursue any major active divergence. So whilst kind of divergence, the idea of diverging and kind of using Brexit freedoms was a major part of the Boris Johnson project in particular, the government under Rishi Sunak has actually largely abandoned the idea of large-scale divergence, active divergence from the EU. So under Sunak, he abandoned the sunset clause under the retained EU law bill, for example. And at UK in a Changing Europe, one of my colleagues does this divergence tracker where he looks basically at active divergence on the UK side. And there's been very little in terms of substantive divergence under Sunak. But the challenge is that the EU is not standing still. So the EU continues to regulate at rapid pace, and this passive divergence has major implications for the UK because those EU rules de facto apply to UK exporters. They have to comply with those rules to maintain access to the single market. So that makes active divergence on the UK side very unattractive. And this is going to be, I think, a major policy challenge for the next government to think about how can you manage the risks stemming from passive EU divergence. So on the one hand, how can you effectively track upcoming EU legislation and also understand the potential risks that are involved and the divergence that might happen before it actually occurs and what it means for UK businesses. And once you've identified kind of the risks from divergence, you have to then think about what you want to do. Do you want to replicate EU legislation in those areas? Do you want to dynamically align with the EU in some areas? And I think that then becomes a political question for Labour as well, because the question is, how do you judge the political risks from that? Are you going to be accused by a Conservative Party of trying to undo Brexit? And I think how flexible Labour is going to be and how much leeway the party is going to have will, to some extent, depend on the size of Labour's majority. So the bigger the majority, I think the more flexibility the party is going to have in those questions. I think you're also going to see a business community that is going to be increasingly vocal under Labour government about not wanting trade frictions between the UK and the EU. So that's kind of going to pull Labour into one direction. But I think on the other hand, or in the other direction, you have Labour's red lines. So as long as you don't join the single market, yes, you can dynamically align with EU regulations, but that doesn't necessarily give you frictionless access because it's not the same. And also, I think there might be some constraints about government capacity. Because Labour is going to have a very full in-tray when it comes into government, if it comes into government, with lots of domestic challenges. And the question is, how can you track what's coming out of the EU and how much civil service time and resource do you want to dedicate to this, and how much time and resource do you want to dedicate to technical and potentially very difficult negotiations with the EU for quite minor agreements like a veterinary deal, which are not going to shift the dial massively when it comes to economic growth, because for that you would have to rejoin the customs union and the single market, and that's just not on Labour's agenda at the moment. So I think there are going to be lots of very difficult questions for Labour government around divergence and alignment.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interesting input in here, but first, before diving a little bit more into trade regulation divergence in specific sectors, David, any further thoughts on this?
Again, I broadly agree. I mean, I sit on an environmental body that was set up by the Scottish Government to dynamically align our environmental legislation with the EU, and they have the political will, but they found it almost impossible because of the scale and the speed of the legislation coming from the European Union. So yeah, I mean, Jannike has really made the key point. It's not about not changing our legislation to move away from Europe. It's about keeping up with the pace of change at the European Union level. The only very minor positive I might be to draw from that is I think the pace of change at European level is going to slow down in the next 5 years, but it will still be brisk enough and still a challenge to keep up with it. And then there is, as has rightly been outlined, the political question. Do you want to put political capital into this? Do you want to put administrative resources into this? And what is the benefit from doing so? And these are questions that an incoming Labour government will have to answer, and there are no easy answers to these questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to dive a little bit more onto trade, and there's been broad discussion of the additional bureaucracy generated by Brexit and the trade divergence that also Jannike touched upon briefly between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland. While these trade divergences have been mostly addressed by the Windsor Framework, which industry sectors would you say have been mostly impacted by Brexit, and why? Jannike.
I would say, in general, smaller and medium-sized businesses have been affected more by Brexit rather than larger corporations, just because large companies have more capacity to, adjust to new rules. Because even though the TCA offers quota and tariff-free trade, there are lots of new non-tariff trade barriers. Such as paperwork, which has to be filled out. And I think that's been a challenge, particularly for the foods and drinks sector, because on top of paperwork, you have kind of physical inspections for plant and animal products. And I think particularly for smaller companies, that has been extremely costly and extremely challenging. And that's why one of the proposals that Labour has made is a veterinary deal, because that would help exactly those sectors. I think one of the challenges, again, goes back to kind of what we discussed previously, is around dynamic alignment. So if you want a veterinary deal with the EU, you will have to accept some form of dynamic alignment with EU rules and regulations. And there are different types of veterinary deals that the EU has with other third countries, with Switzerland and New Zealand, for example, and those entail different degrees of alignment. So I think that's something that Labour has to think through, and what the trade-offs are. Obviously, the more you align, the less paperwork you're going to have. But the more you align, the more of a rule taker you become. So I guess that's kind of the trade-off that Labour needs to think through. I think there are other sectors that have been affected, but in general, probably trade in goods. We see that in the numbers as well. Trade in goods has been way more affected than trade in services. Actually, the services numbers for the UK are looking quite good, and that has different reasons. I think on the one hand, there's more that you can do online, particularly post-COVID. And therefore you don't face the same trade barriers as goods exporters. I think another interesting thing to think through for Labour, and I mean that's already happening, is that actually UK exporters had to face border checks when exporting into the EU from day one, and that hasn't been the case the other way around. So it might be an advantage for Labour that the UK is now in the process of kind of implementing the UK border with physical checks from the end of last month, and kind of further paper checks later this year, because that kind of levels the playing field between the two sides, and means there's going to be more of an incentive for the EU to actually also think about things like a veterinary deal, because their exporters are now also going to feel Brexit, which some of them haven't necessarily so far. So I think I'll leave it at that.
David, is there anything you want to add?
Good last point, and I think that's right. That if you want to negotiate, you have to have something to negotiate about. And this, although I don't approve of it, this will actually help our negotiating position. I think I would add, although services were mentioned, I think the one bit of service I would say that has suffered is financial services through the loss of passporting rights. And although some of our financial institutions have got around that by setting up EU subsidiaries, they haven't all managed to get around them, and it has damaged, in my view, the UK financial services. And I think, kind of off beam a little bit, I would suggest that fisheries, despite the fact they were supposed to be the great beneficiary of Brexit, I would suggest that through loss of fishing rights and access to markets and so on, our fisheries have actually suffered a bit because of Brexit as well. So I agree with those outlined. I would just add those two to the list.
Okay. I wanted to move on to a big topic, freedom of movement. So last month, the European Commission put forward a proposal for the EU-UK Youth Mobility Scheme, which would allow for UK citizens aged 18 to 30 to live, work and study in the EU for up to 4 years. But the proposal was immediately shot down, both by the UK government and by the Labour Party. Do you think there is still scope for easing the freedom of movement of rules between the EU and the UK? And David, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Well, firstly, the short answer on freedom of movement is no.
Okay.
In the short run and probably the medium run, but I hope I'm not being pedantic here, but there is an issue of terminology, because I don't regard the EU-UK Youth Mobility Scheme as free movement. Free movement is generally thought as that you have a right to come to a country, stay, work, etc., etc. The freedom of the Youth Mobility Scheme allows, as you said, youths under 30 to move only for 4 years, and under certain restricted conditions as well. And I think there is a chance of that coming back, because I think, again, we keep looking for things that work for both partners. I think our universities, for example, have suffered because of lack of youth mobility from the EU, and because of, well, I won't go into it, but because we now charge EU students an extortionate rate for coming and studying in the UK. But if youth mobility introduced EU citizens able to study in the UK at the same price as UK citizens, that would be a good step forward. And similarly, EU member states are suffering from skill shortages and from other difficulties. Would welcome youth from the UK moving and studying and working there for a while. So I think this is mutually beneficial, but I'm repeating myself, but let's not call it free movement or it'll never happen. If it's not seen as free movement, it has a chance, I think, even despite the initial reaction from both the major parties in the UK.
Yeah. Jannike, what do you see from your side?
Yeah, I agree with David that obviously the Commission's proposal is not freedom of movement, and there's a problem with kind of the discourse around that in the UK, because that makes it more difficult to come to an agreement because of Labour's red lines on freedom of movement. So the Commission's proposal, well, it's first of all, it's time limited. It's bound to certain conditions like a visa, proof of sufficient means, and it also excludes onward movement rights within the EU. So yeah, it is mobility, not freedom of movement. But at the same time, I would also say that it is certainly a maximalist proposal from a UK perspective. So the Commission's proposal has no quotas. It suggests free access to the NHS and home tuition fees for EU students in the UK. This goes further than other youth mobility deals that the UK has. And it also reintroduces kind of an element of European preference into the UK's immigration system, which a lot of people who voted for Brexit probably disagree with. So I think from that perspective, it is quite it put the Labour Party into a very difficult position to respond to this proposal so soon or so close to a general election. But I think the reaction to the proposal and also the timing of the proposal revealed some kind of enduring Brexit sensitivities on both sides. And for me, it's a sign that negotiations on this are probably going to be difficult, because Labour wants to appear tough on its red lines, and it's now kind of said that, well, we regard this proposal as synonymous with freedom of movement, even though it isn't. And the Commission clearly remains concerned about bilateral approaches from the UK in this area. We know that the current Conservative government has approached a handful of EU member states about bilateral deals on youth mobility. And there is some wariness in the European Commission around that, and they clearly want an EU-wide approach to make sure it doesn't discriminate against some of the kind of maybe eastern or smaller member states. I think the reaction and the timing of the proposal have shown that both sides at the moment prioritize internal considerations over actually getting the deal. So I think that's maybe a sign of things to come, and that for those people who are hoping for closer relations, I think it should be a bit of a salutary warning that this isn't going to be as easy as a lot of people may think, and it's certainly not going to be straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are approaching the final round of questions from my side. So I have two last questions. The first one, David. So you've been European Parliament rapporteur for Maastricht and Amsterdam treaties. How do you see things changed within the council since you were at the heart of these discussions? And what would be your recommendation for Labour on how to engage?
Yeah, in some ways, in terms of foreign policy, not a lot has changed in that member states still see foreign policy as their number one, their red line in terms of what they want control and say over. But on the other hand, now we have a high, since Maastricht, we have a high representative, we have a common foreign policy of some description. But within the council, I would say it's changed to the point where we have, I think I used the expression earlier, we have more fifth columnists than we had before. So we have a number of countries who clearly do not share the EU's overall orientation in terms of foreign policy, particularly partly in relation to Ukraine, partly in relation to China, we mentioned earlier, partly in relation to Israel and the situation in Gaza, and also relations with the US. Some will want to have close relations with Donald Trump, no matter what he does to the EU. So these tensions have existed since the creation of the EU in terms of looking outside, but I think they're perhaps likely to be exacerbated in the coming years. And again, if you go back to the European Parliament elections, while they will not directly impact on these things, the signal that the votes, the parties that are elected in the European elections will send out to the member states is, for me, a worrying one, that some countries will think, well, we cannot go along with certain common policies of the European Union.
And Jannike, one question for you on defence and security. Due to the global developments and geopolitical shifts, perhaps most clearly illustrated by the ongoing war in Ukraine and the establishment of the European political community, the EU and the UK seem to have drawn closer on security and defence cooperation. Do you see that continuing moving forward? And do you expect the Labour government to deepen security and defence ties with the EU?
Yes, is the answer to the second question. I think it's kind of crystallized now that a Labour government would pursue some sort of twin track. So trade easements for selected sectors on the one hand, and then stronger security relations with the EU on the other hand. In some ways, it's a continuation of what's already been happening under the Conservatives, but there are also going to be new elements. I think the war in Ukraine has certainly reinforced the sense that the EU and the UK share the same interests and share the same challenges. And the two sides have worked quite closely in areas like sanctions, but also training of Ukrainian soldiers, intelligence exchanges, and so on. But all of this has happened in a kind of ad hoc and informal manner. So we haven't seen a formalization of the ties between the two sides. And I think that's something that we're quite likely to see under a Labour government. So David Lammy and Keir Starmer have been quite clear that they want a security pact with the EU. We don't know exactly what that entails, but we do know that they want closer cooperation on quite a wide range of areas from military security to economic security, climate and energy security. So quite kind of a wide-ranging approach to security. They want more dialogue, including at the highest political level, which is something that actually isn't necessarily a new idea. If you look back at the political declaration from 2019, which was about the future of the relationship and was signed by both sides, the EU and the UK, under Boris Johnson back then, there was quite an extensive chapter in there on foreign security and defense cooperation. And I think lots of those ideas could kind of come back now, but obviously kind of adapted to the new geopolitical realities. I think there's lots of scope for more dialogue, and I think it's something that the EU would also like, because it's something that they do with all of their key allies. And the UK is a bit of an outlier there in not having a political dialogue with the EU, for example. But I think there are also areas where cooperation is going to be tricky, and defense industrial cooperation in particular, I think. So Labour has said that they want a bespoke relationship with the EU on defense. I think the challenge there is that the way that the EU is developing on defense industrial cooperation at the moment largely excludes third countries that are not part of the single market. So if you look at the EU's defense industrial strategy, which the European Commission published in March this year, the UK isn't mentioned even once in there. It's very much focused on single market members and Ukraine. It's about investing jointly and procuring weapons jointly from EU suppliers or companies that are based in the EU and can give additional security reassurances. So UK firms are going to be largely excluded from that as things stand. There are member states that would like to see more involvement of the UK. Sweden is an example. They've kind of come out and said, well, actually, we want a more open approach to third countries. But at the moment, if you look at the proposal, it's kind of, the rules have been drawn up to favour single market members and to exclude the UK. So I think that's going to be a major challenge, because I think in the Labour Party, there's still the thinking, well, we are a major player in this area and we want something bespoke, and the EU might give privileged access, but I think that's far from certain, and that might be an area for tension between the two sides.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you so much, everyone, for dropping your questions. So I have a few questions from the audience. The first one probably related to the renegotiation of the agreements between the EU and UK. How likely and realistic it is for the new Commission to renegotiate the agreements between the EU and UK with a likely Labour government in the UK over the next 4 or 5 years? I think we touched upon this quickly, but fire quick answer to that one.
I think the answer is there's a very little chance of the Commission giving it its highest priority for all the reasons we've discussed, because of the divisions within the likely divisions politically within the EU and the external challenges that it's facing. So I don't think it would be against improving UK relations, but a wholesale review of the TCA I don't think is on the cards at the moment.
Yeah, fully agree with David on that. I think the TCA is going to remain the basis of the relationship for the next 5 years at least, if not even longer than that.
And another question from Fiona Charlotte. Who is the best American president to build good cooperation with the EU and the UK in the future?
Neither of the two candidates. No, I think, well, the two, Biden, obviously, if we're talking about the short term, the long term, I'm not well enough aware of American politics to know who's coming in 4 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing, I mean, the Trump presidency would be extremely challenging for both the EU and the UK. I guess in terms of the relationship itself, it might push the two sides to cooperate more closely, and it would put more pressure on the two sides to work together. Also in areas like defense industrial cooperation, which I've just mentioned, is going to be really tricky. So kind of Trump could be kind of a factor there that means it's going to feel like more pressing for the two sides to work together. But I think in general, even if we see President Biden in the US, there is a general tendency in US foreign policy that the US is looking more and more towards Asia, that Europe isn't as much of a priority anymore, that there is an emphasis on burden sharing and expectations for Europeans to kind of invest in their ability to defend themselves. So even though it might feel less pressing under Biden presidency, and the EU would, or Europe would get more support as well, and could still count on kind of US leadership, I think under both presidencies there are kind of good reasons for the two sides to work together on security and defense in particular.
Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood, but I didn't catch the question. I've just looked it up on my screen. I thought you was asking about US-EU relations, but UK-EU relations. I think that I think it's right to say that in a bizarre sort of way, Trump would force the UK and the EU more closely together.
Question from Oliver. You've spoken about the appetite for changes with respect to trade in goods. What do you think the appetite is for trade in services? I've touched a little bit upon that. As we understand it, there is a great deal of dissatisfaction from the service sector on both sides of the channel with the current arrangement. Jannike, maybe one for you.
I mean, again, I think there is limited appetite on the EU side in making substantial changes to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. One thing that kind of comes to mind that Labour have said is that they are interested in kind of looking at mutual recognition of professional services. So that might be helpful to certain service sectors, but at the same time, I think there are probably limited benefits without freedom of movement. And also, I think it's going to be very difficult to negotiate these things. So, I mean, there is a precedent between the EU and Canada, for example. They negotiated mutual recognition of professional qualifications for architects, and that went over 9 rounds. And took quite a long time. So I think that's probably the one thing that I would say, no matter what types of amendments or improvements you want to make, whether it's goods and services or whether it's trade in goods or in services, it's going to be highly technical and probably quite long negotiations. So I don't think there are any kind of quick fixes that we're going to see in those areas.
Just to add to that, I mean, the single market is not complete in many ways, but the least complete part of the single market is services itself, and the EU has found it very difficult within the 27 to complete a single market, its services market. So it's not going to be enthusiastic about taking on the task of trying to do it between the UK and the EU.
Yeah. One final question from the audience, from Brian. From an Irish perspective, the North is both a bellwether and flashpoint in relations, with tensions around the deal and over-regulation impacting on peace. What would you say should be Starmer's position on this? Well,
I mean, Starmer is specifically on Rwanda. He's made it clear that the Labour Party doesn't support Rwanda. In terms of relations with the north of Ireland more generally, it's imperfect because leaving was an imperfect position to have. But the Windsor Agreement, I think, has improved relations between the UK and the EU, the UK and Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland and the European Union. So I think it's broadly served its purpose. How long it can be maintained is another question. But I don't. My impression is, but I haven't spoken to anybody directly in Northern Ireland recently. My impression is that a lot of the tension around the so-called border in the North Sea has dissipated thanks to the Windsor Agreement.
Okay. We are really running out of time. I just have one final closing question that is almost like I wanted this to summarize all of our discussions. And Jannike, I'm going to start with you. If you could ask the expected future Labour government to make one change to the UK relationship with the EU, what would it be? 20 seconds answer.
Okay, I'm going to be really quick. I think the first thing that I would say they need to do is rebuild trust, because that's kind of the basis of everything else that follows. If you don't have trust, you're not going to improve the relationship in other areas. And I think it's probably a good idea to not approach the relationship in an overly transactional way from the get-go, but actually invest in relationships, invest in trust, and then kind of everything else will follow from there.
David?
Well, I hate to continue the consensus, but broadly, I agree with that. I mean, the way I see, I want to rejoin the European Union. I mean, no bones about it. And the way I see it is it's a bit like a steam train going up a hill. You have to make incremental steps. You get up the hill, and once you get up the hill, you suddenly gather speed and you go down fast. And I think in terms of our relationship with the EU, it's going to be very, very small steps, one at a time, that build that relationship till eventually we get to the top of the hill and people start thinking, yeah, why are we still two separate entities? Let's get back together again.
Okay. Wow, thank you so much to everyone who joined for the questions, and there's so much to unpack, a lot of food for thought, and yeah, definitely the next 6 months will be quite crucial in terms of the EU-UK relations. So watch this space, I'll say. Thank you so much again, Jannike and David, for joining this webinar, and to everyone who joined, and have a lovely rest of the day.